Hello, sunshines, and welcome back to Cool House Connection. I'm your host, Deb Deckhand, and I love this time every other week when we get to catch up with each other and talk about one of our shared life passions, cool houses. Thanks to each of you for listening and for your comments and shares. We're welcoming new listeners every episode, and that's highly invigorating. Well, those of you who are regulars understand that what we talk about is mostly physical houses available here in gorgeous Yancey and Mitchell counties. We also stretch our wings and embrace the emotional aspects of homes around the world. And in today's episode, we're going to do a deeper dive into what it feels like to actually live in cool and decidedly uncool houses. Let's get started. What happens when a house no longer fits? In other words, what does it mean to outgrow the spaces we once loved? Today we're talking about something that doesn't show up on a listing sheet. It's not square footage, it's not price per foot, it's not even location exactly. It's something quieter than that. It's the moment you realize the house that once fit your life doesn't quite fit it anymore. And what's interesting is that realization rarely comes all at once. It doesn't show up as a dramatic moment where everything suddenly feels wrong. It creeps in. It's slow and insidious. And at first, it's subtle. You might notice you're not using certain spaces the way you used to. A room that once felt essential starts to sit quietly unused. Or a corner of the house becomes more of a pass-through than a destination. Or maybe it's the opposite. Spaces start to feel tight, not physically small, but compressed, like there's more life happening than the house was designed to hold. And nothing is technically wrong. The house still works, the roof still holds, the kitchen still functions, the bedrooms are still there, but something feels slightly off. And it's easy to ignore that feeling, because on paper, everything still makes sense. The truth is, the house stays the same, but you don't. And here's the part we don't talk about enough. Houses don't change nearly as fast as people do. A house is built for a moment in time, a layout designed around a certain way of living, a snapshot of how life was expected to unfold. But life doesn't stay in that snapshot. Families grow or they shrink, work shifts, routines change, and priorities evolve. What once felt perfect can start to feel misaligned. Not because the house failed, but because life moved on. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. Because we tend to assume that if something feels off, it must be the house. But sometimes it's just that we've changed. How many like me remember declaring, "They'll drag me out of this house feet first"? I can count at least 5 houses I proudly declared, "This one is it." I've never been party to the Warren Buffett one house for all of married life scenario. It sounds romantic because that notion evokes all manner of memories. And I love when I see life unfold the way it did for folks like my Uncle Paul, who lived, raised a family, and died in the same house he and my aunt had called home for 68 years. But that's not me. For me, a house that once made perfect sense often evolves into one that doesn't. Think about the moment you chose your home. At that time, it probably made complete sense. Maybe it had the right number of bedrooms, the right layout for your daily routine, the right location for your work, your family, and your life at that moment. It wasn't random. It was a decision that fit who you were then. And that's important because it means the house did exactly what it was supposed to do. It served a version of your life. But what happens when that version changes? Face it, that perfect house may end up being too much space. This often happens slowly. Kids grow up, move out, and rooms that were once full of noise and activity become quiet. At first, that quiet can feel peaceful, but over time, it can start to feel empty. You walk past rooms that are technically yours but don't feel like they belong in your daily life anymore. You heat spaces you don't use, you clean areas that don't get lived in. And there's a strange emotional weight to that. Not because the house is wrong, but because it's holding on to a version of life that isn't happening anymore. I see this downsized chapter change drive so many of my clients, and it's perfectly legitimate. Or then there's the opposite. A house that starts to feel too small, not just in size, but in function. Maybe you're working from home now after the COVID pandemic, and there's no real place to do that comfortably. Maybe your family has grown and spaces that once worked are now constantly being negotiated. You start to feel it in small ways. The lack of storage, the overlap of activities, the sense that you're always adjusting, always trying to make it work. And again, the house hasn't failed. It just wasn't designed for this version of your life. Or what if the layout becomes friction? Sometimes it's not size at all, it's layout. A home can have plenty of square footage and still feel wrong if the way it flows doesn't match how you live. Maybe the kitchen is isolated when you want connection. Maybe the living space is too open when you need quiet. Maybe the primary bedroom's in the wrong place for this stage of life. Maybe the stairs that once felt insignificant now feel like a daily obstacle, even dangerous. These are the kinds of things you don't always notice right away, but over time they create friction. And friction, even in small amounts, adds up. All this affects both the physical space and the accompanying emotional layer. Here's where this topic gets deeper. Because realizing a house no longer fits isn't just a practical realization, it's emotional. After all, there's history there, memories, time invested, decisions made, and there can be resistance to acknowledging that something needs to change, because it can feel like admitting you made the wrong choice. But that's not what it is. Outgrowing a home doesn't mean it was the wrong home. It means it was the right home for a certain time. There's a natural tension between logic and feeling, and this is where a lot of people get stuck. Logically, the house still works. It's in a good location, it's financially manageable, it checks the boxes. But emotionally, it just doesn't feel right anymore. And that tension can be hard to navigate because logic tells you to stay. Feeling tells you that something's off. And we're often taught to trust logic more. But when it comes to where you live, feeling matters more than we like to admit. Leading with logic makes us often try to make it work. Most people first try to make the house fit again. They rearrange the furniture, they renovate, they repurpose rooms, and sometimes that works beautifully. A thoughtful renovation can align a home with a new way of living, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the changes feel like adjustments rather than solutions. And that's because you're working within a structure that may not support what you need anymore. Sometimes it's not about the house at all. There's another layer here that's worth mentioning. Sometimes the feeling that a house doesn't fit has less to do with the house and more to do with everything around it. The neighborhood changes, the pace of life shifts, your daily routines no longer align with the location. Or maybe it's internal. A desire for something different, simpler, more connected, more private. And the house becomes the place where that feeling shows up. Some of us crazies, like me, wholly embrace the change of house that a move portends. We get excited about it. But many more of us have a palpable fear of change. Even when it's clear that a house no longer fits, change is not easy. Moving is certainly disruptive. It's expensive, it's emotional, it's frankly a pain in the ass. And there's always uncertainty. What if the next house isn't better? What if you trade one set of issues for another? So people stay. They adapt, they tolerate, they make it work, sometimes for years longer than they need to. It's really important to recognize the moment when logic gives way to emotion that refuses to be ignored. That moment, quiet but clear, tells us when the current abode becomes undeniable. You stop imagining how to fix the house and start imagining life somewhere else. Not in a dramatic, impulsive way, more like a quiet curiosity. What would it feel like to wake up in a space that actually fits this version of my life? What would it feel like to move through a home without friction? What would it feel like to not be constantly adjusting? And once that question takes hold, it's really hard to ignore. The in-between phase is really interesting. There's a period that happens next that not many people talk about. It's the in-between. You haven't made a decision yet, you haven't listed the house, you haven't committed to anything, but you've seen it. You've recognized that something isn't quite right anymore, and now every day in the current house feels a little different. You notice things you used to overlook. The friction becomes more visible, and the misalignment more obvious. It's not that the house suddenly changed, it's that your awareness did, and that can feel really unsettling, because you're living in a space that used to feel right and now feels like a big old question mark. So do you stay or leave? That's the question. At some point, the question becomes even more direct. Do I stay and adapt, or do I leave and reset? And this is where there's no universal answer. Some people find ways to reshape their homes, to renovate, reconfigure, rethink how spaces are used, and they fall back in love with where they live. Others realize that no amount of adjustment will ever fully align the house with their life anymore. And for them, leaving isn't about dissatisfaction, it's about alignment. But it involves letting go of the idea. And one of the hardest parts of moving on from a home is letting go of the idea of it. The idea that this was the one. The idea that you would stay longer, that life would unfold in a certain way. Letting go of a house often means letting go of a version of the future you once imagined. And that's not always easy. But there's something else on the other side of that. And that's the possibility of choosing again. When you reach a point where you're ready to choose again, something shifts. You're no longer choosing based on who you were. You're choosing based on who you are now. Your priorities are clearer. Your patterns are more defined. And you understand what works, and importantly, what doesn't. And that makes for a very different kind of decision. Often a better one. Not because it's perfect, but because it's aligned. It's a different kind of fit. The goal isn't to find a house that will fit forever. That's a moving target. The goal is to find a house that fits now, in a way that feels supportive, comfortable, and true to how you're living. And to understand that, at some point, that may change again. And that's not failure, that's life. Homes, like us, evolve. So if you've been feeling that quiet sense that your house doesn't quite fit anymore, you're not alone and you're not wrong. You're just noticing something real. You're noticing that homes, like people, have seasons and chapters. And sometimes the most thoughtful thing you can do isn't to force a fit. It's to recognize when the fit is no longer there. Not with urgency or pressure, but with awareness. Because a home isn't just a structure, it's a vessel and container for your life. And when your life changes, it's okay for the container to change too. If you're in or facing a change of seasons in life, and if a better fit home is part of the equation, I encourage you to call my partner, Ryan Phillips. Call him at 828-273-5056 and let us guide you to the next best place for you and yours. Thanks for spending this time with me today on Cool House Connection. If this episode resonated, and if it put words to something you've been quietly contemplating, then it's done what it was meant to do. Because sometimes the most important shifts don't happen all at once. They begin with a simple realization that it might be time to choose again. Please keep telling your friends to choose Cool House Connection. Until next time, stay cool.